Welcome to Lambda Bible Studies. Today I have Jay Burden. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me on.
I'm very glad to have you, yes, at last. And we're talking about Proverbs 31. Not the first stream on my channel about this chapter, but it's so amazing and glorious and wonderful that I'm sure it won't be the last. So I'm excited to dip in to this passage and see what new things we discover on the journey. Here it is. Should we start by reading it? Tell you what, why don't I read half and you read half? I'll do the first 9, and then how about you do the rest?
Sure. Give me a second to pull that up.
Sure.
Thank you.
You ready to go?
Yep.
Great. The words of King Lemuel, the prophecy that his mother taught him. What, my son, and what the son of my womb, and what the son of my vows? Give not thy strength unto women, nor thy ways to that which destroyeth kings. It is not for kings, O Lemuel. It is not for kings to drink wine, nor princes strong drink, lest they drink and forget the law, and pervert the judgment of any of the afflicted. Give strong drink unto him that is ready to perish, and wine unto those that be of heavy hearts. Let him drink and forget his poverty, and remember his misery no more. Open thy mouth for the dumb in the cause of all such as are appointed to destruction. Open thy mouth, judge righteously, and plead the cause of the poor and needy.
Who can find a virtuous woman? For her price is far above rubies. The heart of her husband doth safely trust in her, so that he shall have no need of spoil. She will do him good and not evil all the days of her life. She seeketh wool and flax, and worketh willingly with her hands. She is like the merchant's ships, she bringeth her food from afar. She riseth also while it is yet night, and giveth meat to her household, and a portion to her maidens. She considereth a field and buyeth it. With the fruit of her hands she planteth a vineyard. She girdeth her loins with strength, and strengthened her arms. She perceiveth that her merchandise is good. Her candle goeth not out by night. She layeth her hands to the spindle, and her hands hold the distaff. She stretcheth out her hand to the poor. Yea, she reacheth forth her hands to the needy. She is not afraid of the snow for her household, for all her household are clothed with scarlet. She maketh herself coverings of tapestry. Her clothing is silk and purple. Her husband is known in the gates, when he sitteth among the elders of the land. She maketh fine linen, and selleth it, and delivereth girdles unto the merchant. Strength and honor are her clothing, and she shall rejoice in the time to come. She openeth her mouth with wisdom, and her tongue in the law of kindness. She looketh well to the ways of her household, and eateth not the bread of idleness. Her children arise up, and call her blessed, her husband also, and praiseth her. Many daughters have done virtuously, but thou excellest them all. Favor is deceitful, and beauty is vain, but a woman that feareth the Lord, she shall be praised. Give her the fruit of her hands, and let her own works praise her in the gates.
Brilliant. What was it that made you choose this chapter?
So several things. One, as I told Lambda before you started going, I work a pretty menial job. I have a lot of time to think and to listen. And recently, I went back through all the King's Men, and so there's a section in that where if not the main character, the focus of that novel gives a speech, and it's kind of a character who is a remix of famous Depression era American politician Huey Long, and he gives this speech to the famously corrupt Louisiana legislature, where he compares them to, in my translation, those who destroy kings, essentially these like grasping, this force that drains the power of its kind of vigor, and so that put it in my mind initially. And then also, there's been kind of a conversation in our circles for a while about, what, Day the Distributus has called, based right-wing fornication. The idea that, men in our spheres kind of need to, sow their wild oats and kind of, conquer as many, women as they can to kind of prove their worth. And so I think that obviously those ideas are connected, and that reminded me of this passage. And so it's something, when you reached out to me, that I wanted to discuss.
Yeah, so I think it's clear in this passage that we see in the second half, at least, that there is value in finding a wife beyond just the sexual exploits. So we will we will fully explore that topic. But first, there's this series of warnings. So what's the reason that the king needs to hear this advice?
So I should say I did a little bit of kind of background, research on this. I did my homework, so to speak. And as far as King Lemuel, no one knows who that is. There's some idea that this was kind of a mythological figure, like essentially like a representative good king. Like, listen to this guy. He's kind of like the guy you strive towards. But, we don't really know. And honestly, we can kind of read from the start that this is this person's mother basically like offering them kind of advice. So this is a woman's advice for men. And as we look through this, there are kind of two sections, obviously. So I'm going to go ahead and guess that essentially everyone listening or watching to this is male, just by the subject matter, by the circles we're in. And so these first 9 verses are directly applicable to us. The other half is applicable in the sense that it informs our selection, what we're looking for. But these first 9 verses is, shall we say, directly applicable. It is talking to us. Obviously, we're not kings, but, nonetheless.
I'd say any male listening to Lambda Bible Studies is a king.
Yeah, fair enough. I guess you're right. And so there are a few, I guess, interesting notes in this. So when I was looking into it, verse 3 in particular, the way it's constructed, it doesn't quite translate. But in its original text, that ways which destroyeth kings was a plural concept. It's the idea that there are multiple things which destroy kings. And specifically the way that it's constructed, and I used to speak a little bit of Greek and Latin, but I've completely forgotten it. But the idea is it's kind of this is a idiomatic way to refer to basically like a harem, like a group of women. And obviously, as she's speaking to a ruler, that was something that was relatively popular. Fair enough, right? Interesting in other notes, right? So we see that there are these kind of multiple ways for kings to kind of lose their, vigor and ruling might. Specifically one, the first one brought up is, a harem, lots of women. You're kind of, to use, esoteric right-wing words, as a way to dissipate your vril, to use kind of an autistic term for it. But nonetheless, there's some truth in that meme, so to speak. And the other one is in drink, right? There's this idea that, both excessive sexual exploits and, excessive consumption, they blind you, they knock off your keen edge that you need to rule. And so we see that explicitly, like, pervert the judgment. So obviously, when you think of like, well, what are kings called to do? What is a leader called to do? Right? Well, obviously it says that you don't want to forget the law, right? You don't want to forget even, the rules of existence. You don't want your judgment perverted. And so at least to me, there's obviously a direct spiritual application of that, right? Like, you don't want to be in a situation in which you're not in control of your own moral action, right? I mean, I think all of us, have been in situations where we're not fully in control, and that can lead to obviously materially worse outcomes, but also incorrect moral outcomes. That's a very, technocratic way, but you see what I'm getting at. And so to me, at least, like that first section is kind of the negative proposition. Like, don't do this, don't do that.
Yeah.
And the back, or like the second half of this, is essentially like what you should do as a good ruler. So, for instance, specifically in verse 6, right? So instead of, indulging yourself in, let's just say, the finer things, so women and alcohol and all of these kind of like sensual excesses. Well, what are you supposed to do? Because we're given that both sex and drink have positive roles. First we're given the negative, then the positive. And so, well, you're supposed to use, your drink to those who are perishing, those who are in distress. And when I looked this up, etymologically, because I think that's helpful, is that essentially that there are kind of two ways to read this. There's either, using strong drink as medicine. So like the medicinal use of alcohol is pretty old, right? Like I'm sure everyone's grandparents or great grandparents basically like, oh, you've got a cold, at least in, in my area of the country, well, they give you corn whiskey and you're fine.
Uh-huh.
Well,
Yeah.
another one is, and this goes all the way back to kind of like the very, very ancient Western tradition, like the Homeric tradition, is this idea that the ruler owes his people feasts. The idea that, you are you're the wealthiest man, you control all of these resources. And so what do you do with that? Well, you lift up the poorest in your community. So specifically, right, if we can tie this to, another Western classic, Beowulf. And Beowulf, because it was, written down by Christian monks and passed through the Christian monastic tradition, it is a kind of Christianized version of ancient Western myths. And so the character of Beowulf has a lot of Christ in him, and that was very deliberately done. And if you remember in Beowulf, well, what happens in Beowulf, right? The monster, the evil, Grendel, comes into the mead hall, comes into the king's feast hall, and he wrecks it and destroys it. Well, and what does the hero do? And obviously, our greatest hero is Christ. This is the Old Testament, but it's where the whole document goes towards. What he does is he makes it right, and when he makes it right, he holds a giant feast for everyone. That is his duty. That was seen as the duty of a ruler. And obviously, not all of us are literal ancient rulers. Would that we were. But in the same way that kind of every hero is a smaller version of Christ, every man is a smaller version of a king. That's kind of chain of being. And so that's why, these heroes, obviously both in kind of like Christ is the ultimate version of that, but also specifically these ancient kings, both in the Western tradition and the Christian tradition. We are kind of called towards imitating that behavior. And sorry, I've been talking for 10 minutes, but if you have something to add, please hop in.
Yeah, it's well. I was just going to say, this "give not thy strength unto women" is almost a perfect rebuttal to what you mentioned before, the some of the more degenerate ideas that we've seen being proposed as to how men ought to behave towards the fairer sex, especially because the whole framing of the kind of pickup artists, that sphere, is you should become a 10 as a man, then you will have access to the women, and then you make use of that. Now, the king that's being talked about here, King Lemuel, would have had the access to women that is being talked about by these sort of pickup artist types, and more. Like being an actual king was like the top of the hierarchy. You have the power, you have all the attention. Women would have been throwing themselves, and the advice is don't give your strength to women. And then I think this is that Hebrew parallelism, right, where "nor thy ways to that which destroyeth kings." So we see women and that which destroyeth kings are the same group. So why would it be that women would destroy kings? Well, of course, we see repeatedly through the story of Israel that the kings married women from the surrounding tribes, and the women led them to false worship. So it's the problem is, if you're a powerful man and your attention is taken up by your harem, then you will be destroyed by that pursuit one way or another. So, I mean, it's only one facet of the reason that it's not a good idea to go and sleep around with lots of people. But it is an interesting one. It's kind of a take that I've not seen explored too much. But
Well, and I forgive me for this digression, but I think that there's something to be said in kind of like the internet meme of No Nut November, right? So it's what the 29th now, so I hope everyone in the chat's going strong. But nonetheless, right, there's this idea that and this is kind of an ancient and idea across a multitude of cultures, right? That the sexual act is to a certain extent kind of draining to men, right? And you see this in kind of like, in many ways, in kind of like the kooky, Victorian propaganda, where it's like, oh, it shows you, some strapping lad, and then some like, weak hunchback freak, and it's like, which one of these boys masturbated? Which fair enough, and obviously that may not be medically true, but it can be kind of metaphorically true. And obviously power takes a variety of forms. There's the literal, like, kind of like strength of your limbs, your will, your vril, your vigor, your kind of desire to be in control and in charge. But I think you're right to bring up, just material wealth, because obviously, and anyone who's been in a relationship knows this, women are extraordinarily expensive. Even if you only have one. And so without being kind of like overly punitive about it, you start to do the math on like, well, if you've got like, 15 or 20 around, that starts to add up. And I say that in kind of a joking way, but I'm very serious that like these were, there was no distinction in kind of like pre-nation state society between the king's personal coffers and the coffers of the realm, right? So Hoppe actually brings this up when he talks about why, in general, pre-modern wars were short, because everyone ran out of money. But nonetheless, this is the rough equivalent of, imagine your mayor, and I guess this is actually not particularly hard to imagine in a number of circumstances, using taxpayer dollars to fund his harem. You'd be outraged. And because not only is that, a waste of everyone's money, but this is also money set aside and power set aside for a specific usage, which was the furtherance of this kingdom. And you can kind of draw a similar extension to your own personal finances and your own personal energy, right? And look, like, I don't mean to make this entirely a practical conversation, but I mean, the process, and look, like, I've never really been on the apps. I've never, done that, but for my friends who have, it's an extraordinarily time-consuming and expensive process. It's not a zero-cost activity, and I think that we see a reflection of, of that in Proverbs, which is that, these actions are not morally neutral. They come at a great cost, and that cost is not just, and I don't mean to minimize it, but if you're outside of our personal, value system, it can be minimized. It's not just spiritual. It's not just, oh, it'll affect me down the line. There's a real and immediate downside and cost to those actions.
it's just pondering. Is it possible that "don't give your strength unto women" could also? I mean, we're kind of assuming that the illusion here is the king is being warned not to have a harem at all and don't sleep with all these women. But is there some degree to which the king's strength is, his army and the power to write laws, etc., etc.? Could you read this as don't have women in charge of your decision making? Don't lend her your armies for whatever whims that she would use it for. That's just off the top of my head. It just occurred to me, so could be completely wrong.
Well, so I'll put it this way. I haven't thought of it, but I agree with it. So I'm going to go ahead and say it's definitely what it means.
Great. That's the way we need to approach this.
No, but in all seriousness, I think that there's also something to be said for the fact that there's also a degree of of attention in this. That not just kind of your resources, but also your time, because there is something to be said for the fact that, you do kind of worship what you spend your time on. And obviously I'm not a particularly, I have my own, problems with time management and what I, think about and focus on. But if you are you have your responsibilities, you have your kingdom. And if you're spending all of that time, thinking about women and kind of like directing it towards women, it does kind of rob you of your ability to do anything else, and I realize it's just an easy target to pick on, right? But there's so much energy devoted, and I hope that no one in these spheres kind of falls into this, but in kind of like the simp culture, I'm sending my tier 3 premium Twitch subs to some hot tub streamer, and obviously that's both morally pathetic. We feel a degree of disdain for that person, as you should, but I think that in order to be a kind of powerful men in an optimal sense, men need to have dignity. And being kind of subservient to women in a sense where it's like you're obsessed with, getting the girl, having the woman, that not only starts to rule you, but it starts to rob you of dignity. And I think that kind of like constant desire, I think, really undercuts especially how young men act. And that's, I guess, another like possible, reading I can take from this.
It's yes. I had a quick look in the Hebrew, and it seems like it's a pretty accurate translation to be "give not thy strength to women," and so I think there's no more clues in the original language. It's left up to us to either view this as a euphemism or not. And I'm now thinking it's not a euphemism is more interesting. But I've certainly never heard it talked about in that way before, so that's a discovery if that's the case. Anyway, let's just talk about the wine then for a bit. And in a way, there is a similarity, as you alluded to before, that in both cases, the case where you're going after women, the women case is quite nicely illustrated by the story of Samson and Delilah, where Samson has this literal sapping of strength, having chosen to speak words that pleased his wife. So that's quite a nice illustration of that side of things. But how can drink sap your strength? What's the danger in wine?
Well, and look, like I should clarify in the sense that I am not going to speak this from some kind of like moral grandstanding, right? Like I don't drink often, but I've certainly, drank too much and made poor decisions while under the influence. But I think that all of us who have had, experiences with alcohol, even in a kind of a trivial sense, it's not like I was drinking on, well, Johnny, you can still listen to me prattle on. Anyway, but I think we've all had experiences where we've been kind of clouded by alcohol, even in relatively trivial things. And even if it's just something as stupid as like, oh, why did I say that when it's drunk? Why did I call that person? Why did I, as the members on my Telegram, why did I start a fight with someone's boyfriend? Like, it didn't matter. It was stupid. And that's with someone who has essentially no responsibilities, really, right? Like, it doesn't really matter if you're a guy in your early 20s, because, even if you, as long as you don't get sent to jail, there's really nothing bad that can happen. But
well, you could end up with a child.
Well, yes. Okay, fair enough. Obviously, that was me oversimplifying. I was comparing that to the status of a ruler of a nation, right? So in the grand scheme of things, civilization will not halt. But nonetheless, obviously, in the context of a king, and we see this in figures like Alexander, right, who towards the end of his life, short life, was essentially an inveterate alcoholic. That obviously, there is, and we see this, just a few short verses later, there is a joy to be found in wine. There's a joy to be found in strong drink, and there's nothing wrong with that. But much like sex, and we will read, has a good purpose to it. But it is this, like anything else, that kind of like the sinful nature of man, the sinful nature of reality, these things can be corrupted. And the same, I guess, like essence and nature of alcohol, which we will, hear just a few short sentences later, talking about, uplifting the oppressed, making them jolly, bringing them into this feast. Well, like anything else, too much and it destroys you, too much and it consumes you. And especially we see in both this kind of like call to, and I don't mean literal sobriety, but this call towards clear mindedness, right? Like not letting yourself be clouded by wine or clouded by women, because the things that we do, and I realize I said this in jest, but the things that we do really are important. And when you are not, I guess, capable of interacting with reality as it is, when your vision can be obviously literally distorted. It's much like if you were a king who got drunk when there's an army outside, right? Like it's a dereliction of duty. And so fair enough, you may not have, an army outside. You may not have a kingdom to run, but the example is set there very cleanly.
There's this beautiful contrast between the king who is on the top of the world, and it's not appropriate for him to take the drink that is the sort of opiate of the downtrodden, dulling his senses and lessening his effectiveness. And then on the flip side, you've got the afflicted, him who is ready to perish, and him of heavy hearts. And for those people, actually drink is recommended. So it's almost an Ecclesiastes style, a time for all things. Actually, strong drink is appropriate as an anesthetic. If you're about to die, you're not in a position where you're about to do judgment and law keeping. So this is specifically words for kings who are in positions of power. And it's wrong for people to be in positions of power. It's being in power is a position of great responsibility, and you should do so sober-mindedly.
Right, definitely. And we actually see the last exhortation in verse 9 is basically to judge righteously, right? Like that is the calling to the king, right? Like you were, in addition to all of this, kind of bringing in, the poor and the downtrodden into your, into your feast, giving them drink. It is something that you are called to both do that and to judge. And if your primary purpose is to be a judge, is to offer kind of like impartial and like sober judgment, well, you can't be, you can't do that while drunk, essentially.
So then the passage moves on and starts talking about the virtuous woman. Her price is far above rubies. And it says, who can find a virtuous woman? So such a person is not described as being common or easy to locate, but as we will see, she's quite a formidable force, and certainly somebody who's of enormous joy and pleasure to her husband and her family.
Well, and there's a line. So my old boss, who's now passed, was not a very good man at all, but he had a knack for the English language. I'll put it that way. And he said, "There's a reason divorces are so expensive, and it's because they're worth it." And obviously, I disavow. I don't agree with that in the way that he meant it. But there's something to be said that if you've ever known someone in a horrible marriage, it comes to a point where literally the money doesn't matter. They don't care. They would almost give up anything to get out of that. And obviously, being a fairly traditional Christian, the role of divorce is very limited. But nonetheless, there is something to that in the idea that like there comes a point at which rubies, at which things of great monetary value pale in comparison to like, well, what is my life like on a moment to moment basis? And if my life is miserable because my relationship is horrible, and obviously it takes two to tango, but there is a sense in which that is manifestly and observably true. And I think all of us have seen truly how much even very wealthy people are immiserated by bad marriages.
Oh, we just got some spam in chat. I don't think this is a fair summary of Proverbs 31. What do you reckon? It seems
Uh,
reductive.
yeah. This is also the wrong place to look if that's what you're going for.
Well, let's go through some of these attributes. The heart of her husband doth safely trust in her, so that he shall have no need for spoil.
That's actually an
What's
interesting.
important here? Yeah, go on.
Well, because I feel like one of the real, and I maintain that a lot of the fights on our side of the internet are largely fake. Uh, and I think that the fight about based right wing degeneracy and universalism and particularism are essentially the same fight, and it really boils down to pro or anti Christian. Because that's essentially what it is. It's just different frames for the same argument. And I feel like this actually indicates that disagreement quite neatly, right? Because others would say, kind of like the more Nietzscheans, who, again, I have a great deal of personal affection for on an individual basis, but would say, like, yes, like, conquer, gain, get your spoil, like, go out there and grab it, have your will to power. Whereas in Proverbs, we see that, like, look, like, you don't need spoil. If you have this kind of like similar form of joy, if you have a good relationship, if you have a family, you don't have this need for, conquering. And depending on how you read that, that's either, yes, we got them. They're weak. They're pathetic. Or on the other hand, it's like, well, we kind of live in a world where not everyone can be a conqueror. Not everyone can be at the head of their own, tribal warband. One, just because of how math works. And two, because I look around and I'll be honest, I'm a little skeptical of the possibility of steppe nomads coming back anytime soon. And so to me, it's like, well, this is a solution to the problem of, men having this, desire to essentially like to conquer and to fight. Well, obviously not every man can conquer and fight, nor would we really want to live in a world in which everyone is trying to. And I think that this kind of offers an alternative to that.
I've given Lady of Shalott a spanner to moderate my chat, so I feel like it's in good hands now. So she will do him good and not evil all the days of his life. She seeketh wool and flax and worketh willingly with her hands. She's like the merchant's ships. She bringeth her food from afar.
So this is actually a whole section which really goes through the rest of it, where we see kind of the role of a pre-modern woman. So the progressives are not entirely wrong when they skewer the kind of 1950s, stay-at-home mom, kind of skewer that as a pointless existence. There's a reason that all of those women were on benzos, and it's not just a leftist conspiracy. It's because before the Industrial Revolution, there was a forced cooperation between the sexes. Essentially, if you didn't operate as essentially a fully, a fully functional economic unit, everyone starves to death. And so this idea that, women are just supposed to stay at home where they, cook and clean, look pretty, and that's it. It's just not real. And so we see in this that, the ideal wife or the ideal, woman is incredibly busy and not doing easy things, not doing things that are trivial. We see both, making textiles because there was no, centralized manufacturer. And so if you had clothes, well, a woman in your immediate area made it. They repaired it. These were necessary things. Obviously, when we see, talking about her as a, she is like merchant ships, kind of like the, the older version of, like an Amazon delivery, right? Like going out, bringing things into the home, getting what you need. So we see also like, this is someone who is, getting up early to do these things, obviously. So a good example is something like making bread, right? Where because of the way bread works, it takes an astonishing amount of time to make, both in the, actually like the kneading and the baking, but also it just has to sit around. It has to prove, it has to do all these things. So there was kind of this rhythm of daily life that would involve getting up early, start the dough, prove it. And there were a whole series of these things that required you to be constantly active and constantly moving through the day. This wasn't, wake up at 8, drop the kids off, sit at home with the TV on, this kind of like Jetsons era vision that so many quote unquote trads want to return to. Like, that's not what it was. It was a struggle for both halves, both men and women. And look, I've had my disagreements with Anglo Ortho, but nonetheless, he's dead right when he talks about avoiding the framework of, the sex war, of the race war. And one of the really just stupid, moronic things I see people on our side of things engage in is this idea of like, oh, well, if we're in a sex war, if we're in a war between the sexes, we're just gonna fight back harder. Like if women screwed us over, we're gonna screw them over even harder. And not only is that not productive, but that's not how humans were designed to operate. There was this complementarian nature where obviously on one hand, well, who provides the primary monetary inflow? Well, it's men for the things that you can't necessarily, make yourself. Well, who provides the raw materials? Whether that's wood, whether that's meat, whether that's the fruit of the fields. Well, it's men. But on the other hand, it's like, well, if you're working in the field for 10 hours a day, who makes the bread? You can't. It takes too long. Who makes the fabric? And so in all of these, we see that there is a division of labor, and there is a honest way for both men and women to behave. And so I spoke to, my friend Thomas about this kind of like reciprocal version of masculinity and femininity. And there's a lot of conversation on our sides of things about, the kind of like martial nature of man. Like there's a part of your brain that wants to go out there, get into a fight with someone, kill a woolly mammoth and bring its head home. Like that deep primal nature, this idea that kind of conflict and getting like blooded as a man, that makes you a man. Battle, that is the dangerous thing your life is directed towards. And fair enough. But in the ancient world, and the ancient Hebrews would have been very very aware of this. The idea was that women had a similar version of that. Obviously it was childbirth, and that's because both men and women, their lives were oriented towards extremely dangerous and difficult physical acts, and there was something great required of you. And so my point in this is not at all to simp, to view, women as these kind of like angelic beings, as kind of like the Victorians and the Edwardians were kind of tempted to do. A big shock. Women are people with all of the, the faults and foibles that come along with that. But there is a equally, I guess, honorable and respectable path for women, similar to men in a martial sense, in kind of the, the activities of the home. And I guess that's kind of what I wanted to get at with this passage. Do you see what I'm speaking about?
Yeah,
that?
for sure. It's easy to think that if you just go back to the 50s and then extrapolate linearly back into the past, you will discover what life was like thousands of years ago. But actually, there were specific issues that the culture in America, say, had fallen into. And I think the affluence that had happened, the great productivity, had actually led to quite a lot of sort of laziness, failing to be properly productive, and so when we think of a stay-at-home mum as the pinnacle of trad womanliness, that is sort of going against, well, I think bringing up children should be a paramount priority, but that's not the priority that's being described here for what the woman is doing, is just being a mother and nothing else. She's actually got all this other activity that she's getting on with.
No, definitely. I completely agree. And it's this idea that, we were kind of, sussing out before we went live, that there's a certain extent to which, and I think it really hit in the 50s, but it hit like a truck in the 90s, that essentially, as the West, we kind of live in pointless societies. Like really, like what is the point of society? Like if you ask that, someone
Yeah,
doesn't really know. Like is it
right.
to be more materially successful? I guess maybe. I mean, really,
Well,
like
it
what was
increasingly looks like the point of society is just to dismantle itself.
well, right, and that's what I'm saying. That I think that there's a part of society, even unwittingly, that essentially realized like, well, we're pointless. We might as well just self-destruct.
Hmm.
And obviously, there are a variety of ends towards which a society can be, directed towards. And I think that you're very much right that the kind of material accesses that we were able to achieve really did rob us of purpose. There's this line, and it's kind of stupid, but it's very much true. It said that no one running from a saber-toothed tiger ever thought about the meaning of life. And buried in that is this idea that like, well, you're not sitting up late at night, asking these kind of like theoretical questions when you're literally just trying to make it through the day. And
How do I
obviously,
find self-expression as I run for my life? Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And obviously, the society that we're reading about, this was I don't exactly know the exact era, but that kind of this ancient society, it was not quite at caveman level. Obviously, these people had, they had cities, they had towns, they had they had courts, things like that. They weren't savages by any means, but they lived in much closer proximity to death, right? Like it was a distinct possibility that if there was a famine, everyone wouldn't be okay. If there was a plague, it wouldn't just be old people. That
Hmm.
this was there was real danger to life. And so that's why I brought up, childbirth and war, because they're kind of two sides of the same coin of this like idea that, when life was dangerous, when life was hard, everyone had to have a purpose. There was no room for kind of dead weight. And I think that what we increasingly find ourselves in, and, fair enough, maybe I include myself in this, is that like, if you really ask people like, well, what is your purpose in society? That's a hard question. Like how many of us really are like, well, I did some, essential service. And so I want to say this just to say that there's this tendency of trads, people like you and I, and I'm not lumping you into this. I'm just saying our group
No, yeah.
to kind of treat people who have had different, I guess, like previous experiences with relationships kind of poorly or harshly, to basically kind of look down on those people. And obviously, everyone has their different path, and it would be great if everyone had a perfectly healthy relationship with these things, but that's not how the world works. And I think that the reason that that's so difficult is that these things we're reading about, these are no longer the default. They're a choice. You know, legitimately, like, and I say this for both women and men, you don't have to be hardworking and dedicated and smart to survive anymore. You really don't.
Hmm.
Like you can coast your way through life. Whereas, and I'm not to say that everyone, all of our ancestors were, these kind of like ultra super genius, hardcore, like warriors. By no means. But there was just a hard limit on how stupid, how lazy, and how selfish you could be. Just by virtue of the
Hmm.
fact that there wasn't enough to go around. And so we really are in this odd situation where the kind of baseline behavior of our ancestors is something we have to strive for. And so we do have to kind of artificially reconstruct these things. Like it's not a direct one-to-one translation. Like, well, okay, well, what does, what does, what is the modern version of considering a field and buying it? That's not a direct translation. That's not an easy translation. And that may be
Hmm.
a simpler version, but I do feel a great deal of sympathy, for people in our situation, because this is not an easy thing anymore. Maybe it never was, but at least now it very much is something that has to be deliberately gone about.
Well, I was going to say, there's it's not necessarily the case. It's easy to think, if only I were born however long ago when everybody lived these attractive marriages. But it is described as who can find a virtuous woman? As in, even if you're a king, you're going to struggle to locate a woman who actually lives up to this ideal. And I don't think that's a slight on women in comparison with men. It's just to say this is a high standard to hold. So if women are listening and are looking at this list and thinking this is quite intimidating, um, I think that's an appropriate reaction, and you should look at that high standard and genuinely try and achieve it. Likewise for men, how am I ever going to find a wife who actually, I seem to have been searching around and none of the options match this. Well, that's kind of what the passage says. Who
No,
can
and
find?
I completely agree with you, and I think that, and I realize this is a pretty, this can be a contentious concept, so I don't want to get into it too much. Oh, thank you. But at least from my kind of like theological perspective, I believe that human nature is a relative constant. People are always essentially the same, you know.
Right. Yeah.
But I think that there's a real struggle among guys on our side of things who are looking around for women and basically being like, well, where are all of the women who don't hate me? You know? And so I just wanted to say that and maybe I got off, ahead of my skis there, that I recognize that difficulty, and I feel a great deal of sympathy for it. And I think that as we kind of need to remind ourselves that, so many of the things that we think are, in a historical sense, incredibly normal and basic, but we live in these kind of unprecedented times where normal is very difficult to find. And obviously, look, like you said, this was a aspirational goal. It was difficult to achieve. I just mean to say that I think there's a lot of guys looking around and they're basically like, well, I'm not even looking for great. I'm just looking for normal, And so I meant to say, like, I didn't want to come down as like why can't you all find your trad wives? I recognize that there's a difficulty in it. So that was my only point.
Yeah. But I think you may be right that there is even more difficulty finding a woman who is virtuous, given that I do think the environment that you're in affects you and will make you more or less virtuous, and that we certainly have less and less pushes towards virtuous behavior from wider society.
Well,
But clearly, even back when this was written, which let's suppose it was at the height of Israel's both prosperity and moral virtue, whatever it did manage to achieve, even then it was difficult to find this.
no, definitely. And I think that it's it's good to bear in mind, right, that the reason a lot of us are here is essentially that there's no regime approved path for people like us forward. People who look like you and me. Like there's no, I guess, like politically acceptable, culturally acceptable, I guess, like role model for you and I, really. There are a few, but it's few and far between. And so I think it's easy to look at people who do have acceptable role models to follow, who do have like a culturally approved route. So like, why can't you notice it? And I think that a lot of us kind of overestimate our own personal sense of being the boy who points out that the emperor has no clothes, because we feel like we see it. And I think that a lot of us see it because we're kind of forced to. And so I feel a great deal of sympathy for, women who are kind of fed a series of lies. This will make you happy. You can have it all. And look, like we see this, and I'm sorry, I'm not trying to make this an overly political stream. We can get back to the passage, but you see this in the series of articles by women in their late 30s and early 40s. Like, why can't I find a man? Why can't I start a family? And obviously there's a little bit of schadenfreude in that, especially when it's the blue-haired types. But there's another sense where it's like these people have been lied to. They were told that they would have meaning, that they would, have fulfilling lives. And I think that we see in this, a broader theme that essentially like the good life, the well-lived life is not an easy thing, right? Like the ideal woman is one who essentially works incredibly hard, sacrifices her time for others. We see the same thing in the example of the king. Like, don't get drunk. Don't don't lose yourself in leisure. That the good
Yeah.
man, like the life full of meaning is one of struggle in a sense. And
Hmm.
so that's hard. That's a hard sell. And my point that I wanted to get back to is that didn't used to be a sell. That was just the way
Hmm.
it was. Whereas now, that like so much of this meaning is something that you have to kind of either be lucky enough to wander your way into, or you have to find by, kind of like the school of hard knocks, so to speak.
There's a sense in which this is advice for the king for what he should be looking for. There's also a sense you could look at it almost like what what's the king looking for women applying for the role as king's wife, which is obviously, you know, the dream, like becoming the Disney princess that every young girl would dream of. What does her life need to look like? And we've got so being hands-on creative, working with her hands with wool and flax, rising while it is yet night. So before the sun's come up, she's up and busy with activities. She's taking care of her household. She's engaged in, let's say, wise purchasing, in particular of land and the development of that land for productive purposes. She's physically strong. The things that she makes are of good quality, not just making her money, but she's actually doing good things for the world. Her candle goeth not out by night, which reminds me of the story of the is it the seven virgins? The
Yeah, I believe
parable
so. And that was
Jesus
actually that
gives.
was something I noticed as well.
And she's generous and compassionate. Then, interestingly, her household are clothed with scarlet, which seems seems like an unexpected moment of excess, given that we were previously talking about how they're almost living hand to mouth. But suddenly, this expensive and aesthetically beautiful, generous clothing that she's given to her household, which is a sign of the fact that she's got enough wealth that even when it snows, there's no fear. The snow is a risk to those who are poor, but because she's got this this excess of she's so productive and so effective in her working that the whole household is then kind of under her protection. She, her clothing likewise silk and purple even more so. So her household in scarlet, herself in purple. I just find it difficult to imagine anybody properly drinking in this picture of what the woman is doing in partnership with her husband and not seeing this as compelling, empowering, amazing life that any woman should long for and be delighted with if she can achieve it.
No, I completely agree with you. And this is something that is, I don't want to get too sappy here, but this is one of the things that I truly do admire about my fiance. I'll just use this as an example, right? That, for
Everyone in
instance,
chat go,
no,
oh,
no, oh, gosh, I got reprimanded about this, but this is relevant. I'll put it that way. So essentially,
keep
right,
going.
and if you've seen women do this, it's quite impressive. Is that there is a definite difference between a male space and a space a woman has been in. So look, I live with a bunch of I live not with a bunch. I've lived with bachelors my entire life. Thank you, Bullfrog. But regardless, right? But and I'm sure you know, right? A house with all men is
Yeah.
at best a Spartan place. It is not it is not a
Yeah.
beautiful thing. And look,
Yes.
my house is probably cleaner than most, and even then, it took us 3 months to get a couch. We were sitting on the floor. I'll put it that way. But nonetheless, right? There is this ability to make a place nice, to make a place, beautiful and edifying.
Hmm.
And it's one of those things that you don't notice how much it matters until you've had it. And then once you've had it, and obviously there's, that's not a direct correlation to, to scarlet and purple and gold and all that. But nonetheless, you realize like all of a sudden, like, oh, this is what makes something a home. This is what makes something, kind of like worth living in. And you see that in addition to kind of her talking about, planting a vineyard, this idea of laying down things that are, kind of like beautiful and last and continue to like provide and enrich. And to me, at least, like that ability to kind of like transcend above the kind of like practical and necessary to kind of add those things that truly do make, like a home or a community worth having. I think that that's like kind of an essential role of, the feminine.
Her children arise up and call her blessed. Her husband also, and he praiseth her. I've heard commentary on this verse that words of affirmation are really important to women, so that's probably a lesson for men to take to heart. Well, and children, why not tell your mother that she is blessed if she deserves it? I suppose if she's awful, then don't. But I think most of us can think of all the ways that our mums have sacrificed and loved us throughout our lives, and she would appreciate having that recognised verbally. Many daughters have done virtuously, but thou excellest them all. I know this started out as a sort of hypothetical, but it seems to have turned into this is a praise for somebody. Somebody's actually being addressed here explicitly. And then favour is deceitful and beauty is vain, but a woman that feareth the Lord, she shall be praised. I think for like my observation of women, especially moving through to their late 20s and into their 30s, is that they are quite conflicted or even dismayed at the fact that they are aging and that they're maybe they're anticipating losing some of their youthful beauty. But I think in this passage we clearly see that the real value of a wife is not in her beauty, right? It's this giant list of stuff, and the only mention of beauty is in verse 30. Beauty is vain. Vanity, the same. I assume it's the same word from Ecclesiastes. Vanity, like this thing that you can't hold on to that slips through your fingers. Meaningless or vanity, or it's that beauty is this thing that you can just appreciate as a transient, or in some cases just you could be completely misled by it. That if you've been bewitched by somebody who's beautiful but has none of the rest of these properties, your life will be incalculably worse than finding a woman that feareth the Lord.
Well, I completely agree with you, and obviously some of this is just good fun because guys will just talk about women. It's what happens. But I think that there's this weird dynamic among terminally online Zoomers, constantly like talking about their type. They're like, oh, this is the type, this is the type, this is the type. And Lady of Shalott, that's great. I'm going to try and tie it into that. But I honestly do think that as long as I don't know how to say this delicately, most men will be fine with all but like the lower 10 to 15%. Like really, you'll be fine. Like really, like most, there are very few guys who are just as like crippled by that. Like really, you'll be fine. And also, there's truly something to be said that the fact that something becomes lovely over time. And I think there's
Mm,
two concepts that get elided together in modern discourse, and that's the idea of hot and beautiful, right? So, for instance, if I ask you
mm.
to think of a hot woman, you can think of a hot woman. If I ask
That
you to think of
person
a
in
woman,
chat used the word hot earlier. The person who was trying to shill for
oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
some
But
degenerate service.
if I ask you to think of a woman who is hot but not beautiful, that you can think of. Now, conversely, if I ask you to think of someone who is beautiful but not hot, you also can think of something, and they're completely different people. Like, and so what I mean to say is that that beauty, and this is not, and this is going to sound kind of like gay and Disney, but I don't mean it in that sense. There is something to the fact that something becomes lovely because of the time you've and the effort you've spent with it, and whether that's a relationship or a place, you really can build this like long lasting, I guess, like affection towards something. So the example I
Mm.
use, and this is one I've taken from Ernst van, I can't remember his last name, Conscious Caracal, where he talks about this, where his late father in their tiny little town in rural South Africa planted trees running up and down, the main drag. They put work in, they put time in, they planted a vineyard. And so look, like the reason that his town is beautiful now, that the reason that a relationship is beautiful, and I'm sure these couples who are incredibly aged but still have a beautiful relationship, despite the fact that
Mm.
even from the most charitable eye, they're not exactly lookers anymore. And it's because there's kind of like time and effort put into it. It makes something lovely over time. And to go back to what Lady of Shalott said, that if the only value you have as a woman is your youth, is your beauty, then of course you're terrified of losing it. But when you have something outside of that, if you have these kind of traits that we see, throughout this passage, you have a sense of worth that outlasts that. You have a purpose. You have something to do in life. And so much like many of us in society, much like our societies feel pointless, like the only thing that there is just to be, to be young and hot and, fire off all your pleasure centers, indulge your lizard brain. Well, when that capacity diminishes, when you can no longer be young and hot and, activate neurons, well, what point is there? You're a useless person. And so to me, at least, like this is an encouraging option because it frees you from that pointless existence, right? There is an end to your life in kind of this immediate level. And obviously I'm not talking like cosmologically, what is the chief end of man? But I mean on that kind of like immediate day-to-day level, like why am I here? Why do I do the things that I do? Do you see what I'm getting at there?
Yes, 100%. I was just thinking, whereas earlier in the stream I said this was a rebuttal to the first 9 verses is sort of a rebuttal to the pickup artists of the world. I think the second half is a rebuttal to MGTOW. Now, there is enormous risk, I would say, for a man getting married these days, because if the woman at any point for the whole rest of his life decides she wants to ruin him, she has the full backing of the state to essentially do so. And there's no way to protect yourself with a prenup or there's really no defense, except if you marry a woman that truly fears the Lord, then you don't need to fear that, and you have all of these benefits. So for any men who have been tempted towards that way of thinking, where you say, well, men's lives are just ruined by women, I think here is a serious dose of ancient wisdom to the contrary that says, as men, it's not good to be alone. God's made a a helper fit for the job for us, and this is just a bit of a sketch of how your life can be made infinitely better by having her at your side, doing all these amazing things, and if she truly fears the Lord, you can actually expect her to start to show the fruit of the Spirit, as I was discussing with Anglo author just the other day, that it's inevitable that a Christian's life will transform in a positive direction. Um, so I guess if I was going to give one takeaway from the chapter, it would be that for women to aspire to be like this, and for men to aspire to find somebody like this. That seems like the unavoidable message that screams out from this chapter. And I think that's a much more positive, cheerful message about the relation between genders without being unrealistic. This is advice that has hope without being naive.
No, I think that's well said. And obviously that, I recognize the dangers in that. I'm not trying to, encourage anyone to do anything rash, but I do agree with you that there is kind of a strong positive vision in this.
Well, it's a amazing CV that this hypothetical woman has put together, and I think it's just a vision that should capture us. Like, if we want to, people paint different visions for what does trad life look like, and is it in the countryside, or can it happen in the city? Do we XYZ? I'd say this chapter is a pretty good guiding light, as a picture of what life ought to look like if you're living it in a virtuous way. Working creatively. Your life will be enriched by food from afar, so exciting food, exciting clothes. Planting vineyards, which is like what Adam was asked to do in the garden, and physically using your body, strengthening your arms. That's kind of like the female equivalent to hit the gym advice, I suppose. Being generous and not acquisitive. All this kind of activity is. These are the kinds of things you should look back across your last year, and say, are these the kinds of things that I've seen going on in my family? I guess.
Well, that's well said. I completely agree.
Any last thoughts before we wrap up here?
No, I don't think so. I think we did a good job covering it. I don't have anything else to add. Sorry, I was a little slow responding. I accidentally had myself muted, but.
Oh, did you? Sorry, you probably thought I was talking
never
over
make
you.
That mistake, but every once in a while I make that mistake.
Well, I mean, everyone else was unaware of that and just thought that you were giving me space to to elaborate and talk further. I guess one last chance to say whatever you were attempting to say into the void.
Yeah. Thank you. So what I would say is that there's a bit of wisdom from C.S. Lewis, right? That everyone really gets what they want in the end, and you've got to understand. Look, like, beauty is good. You should be attracted to your wife. You should be attracted to your, the women that you're, around in that that came out wrong. You know what I meant? But if that is the sole variable you're maximizing, if you're looking for the maximum of sexual satisfaction, this beautiful woman, you will get that and nothing else. And look, like, there's a great piece of wisdom, I think, again, from Dave, the distributist, where he says, look, like, every woman eventually turns into an old woman. You can't get around it. And look, like, maybe your plan in life is to just continually, trade, to use kind of crude language, to trade in for a newer model, but that's no way to build a life. And if all you're looking for in life is essentially, the maximum amount of, sexual release, well, fair enough, you may get that, but that's an empty goal in life. That's a pointless thing to, orientate yourself towards. And so, to me, at least, as we kind of, all of us in these circles, reject and rebel against modernity, reject this, kind of pre-made path, the question comes up, well, like, what do you orient your life towards? And I think that, the relationship, the path that you take towards, family and your community outlined in this is obviously not the entirety of the picture, but it's a big part of it. And to me, at least, we're kind of past the point of looking for an easy life. If you want ease, you're in the wrong area. But if you want a meaningful life, if you want a life with purpose, a life that is fulfilling, you're going to have to give up some of the ease, but you know what? Well, here's a blueprint of it. And that's kind of my reading on this situation.
Uh, I was just thinking how much more I would rather if I were, say, in my 70s. It's so much better of a vision to be in a decades-long loving marriage to a woman of a similar age than to have been in a series of empty sexual encounters and short-term relationships with women who are increasingly distant from your own age. As Lady of Shalott was saying in chat, the Leonardo DiCaprio approach to life.
Well, and I think that you see this, and the pagans understand this even, right? Like Aristotle, when asked, like, well, what is a good death? And he describes this vision of, laying on your deathbed, and you're in your estate, kind of surrounded by your children and grandchildren, that you have contributed greatly to society. And obviously that doesn't save you. That's not a salvific vision. But nonetheless, if you're essentially looking, well, how do I, as a man called to kind of like a relatively normal life, well, how do you, like, what's the best version of that you can hope for? To me, at least, that idea of having a kind of like a long series of commitments, of giving of yourself to kind of much like the king at the beginning, giving up these kind of like temporal and immediate, instant gratifications of, like women and drink, that is something that builds a very positive, that builds that builds the ideal life.
Well, I hope that I haven't contravened this instruction not to give my strength to women by giving the moderator spanner to Lady of Shalott.
I don't know. I think you did. You might have to take that away. I think Vingle's in chat, so
I'm gonna have to go and think about that. I may withdraw that privilege. But I mean, if she's, as long as she's not subverting my will in any way that I notice, then maybe it's not such a bad idea. After all, the woman here is, well, I realise that the analogy gets quite awkward when you think that he's describing his wife, whereas I'm just talking about.
Well, let's just gloss over that, not go into the details, and pretend it never happened.
I bought this analogy before it gets any worse. Anyway, I hope that's been a helpful dive back into this chapter. Now, Jay Burden, where can we find you else online? You have an excellent YouTube channel. I believe you also have a Discord, a Telegram.
So I run the Jay Burden Show, which is a series of roughly 2 or 3 times a week, hour-long interviews with people in our circles. Hopefully, Lambda, you'll be out. One of these days, we'll set something up. I've spoken to a lot of our friends. I've spoken to AA, Thomas, almost anyone in our circle. I've probably had them on, and I generally try to do more, I guess, out there, less predictable interviews. And that Jay Burden Show is available both on YouTube, and then also it's available on Apple, Spotify, anywhere you listen to podcasts. You can find my show. I do have a Telegram. I'm not publishing it anymore because, well, you can find it if you do some digging. There are already too many people in my stupid chat. I don't need more. But you can also find me on Twitter where I post just any idea that comes to mind. I'm not going to say it's great, but it's there. And YouTube is definitely my primary platform, though. And thank you again for the opportunity. I really enjoyed this.
No, I'm very grateful for having you, and yeah, I really enjoyed this stream. All right, thanks everyone.